It's such a pleasure and a privilege to have you in our studio. I know that we are all deep listeners to your body of work, and you're here today because you're in town to perform a truly great piece of music, George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue with the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so we are just thrilled that you're here to talk about it with us today.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm honored and privileged as well, and I'm so glad that Gershwin wrote that great piece. He may have suspected that it would be around 100 years later. He did eventually become very used to having hits. At one point, he said the hits are just dripping off my fingers. So he was a confident fellow and loved jazz and obviously loved classical music. So yeah, I'm very glad to be performing this with this fantastic orchestra.
As you say, he composed so many pieces that are, in the standard repertoire, including some like I Got Rhythm that really form a backbone of the language, Yeah. But Rhapsody in Blue is really an interesting case because, some pieces of music, you can't exactly fix a birth date to them. But in this case, there really is a date, February 12th, 1924.
Aeolian Hall.
When it had its premiere at Aeolian Hall in New York, courtesy of the Paul Whiteman Orchestra. And I know you've done a lot of research around this event and the circumstances. Can you tell us a bit about how this piece came to be?
Well, the original, my understanding is, he saw an advertisement in the paper saying that he was going to do it.
Right.
And so I don't know if he freaked out or if he called up Paul Whiteman and said, "What are you doing?" But he apparently composed it in 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at an original score of it, it literally has stuff in it like Look at George, it's truly an improvisatory set of cadenzas that he did for this piece.
Right.
Now, did he know it was going to be a masterpiece? Again, I don't know. Now, there's a famous quote by Maurice Ravel who said that the masterpiece has no style. It's the sincerity of the artist that brings it to life.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think of Rhapsody in Blue, it's almost different in some ways. As many great pieces as Gershwin wrote, obviously the fantastic piano concerto he wrote a following year in 25, and there's an American in Paris. There's all these great works. But Rhapsody in Blue is the one piece that a lot of people just seem to know and like.
Mm-hmm.
It was a hit. And I think that people will be wanting to play it 100 years from now.
Yeah. It really was a hit, and it was even a hit that night at Aeolian Hall. From what I understand, this was an audience that, by the time Gershwin's piece came up in the concert program, a lot of people were pretty tired and, they were overheated and, not in a good mood. And still the piece communicated so clearly that there was a rapturous reception, in that audience. It really is a piano-centric work. And in fact, in that 1924, the original score, Gershwin as a pianist, he really based this piece on what was at his fingertips, so to speak.
Yeah.
And what insights can that provide for us in understanding this symphonic work as, sort of first and foremost, a piece from the piano?
Well, the thing about George Gershwin, too, though, his concept of piano was actually based on, like a lot of jazz musicians, it was really based on his pianistic style, which is not necessarily pianistic. It's hard. A lot of the things in that piece, if you play it as written. So Gershwin knew what he was capable of doing. He knew what he liked to do. And identity is a big part of improvisation. Like, you've got to have a concept of what your style is based on and what it's based upon. At the same time, he had a great love for Maurice Ravel's work and for classical music in general. So he was really one of the first ones to literally decide that let's see if we can bring these two worlds together. And of course, the piano has a central role in European classical music, right? Mozart wrote, 17 or 18 piano concertos. Beethoven wrote 5, the great 2 Brahms concerti and the 4 Rachmaninoff, etc. So I think in terms of his own style, the thing to keep in mind with Rhapsody in Blue is the themes are so American, right? They are soulful. They're based on an African-American sensibility in terms of the blues, right? If you look at... you know what I mean? That sounds like something you might hear somebody just play that in the context of a solo. It's very recognizable, right? And of course, there's the heavenly theme in E major. Etc. I think the thing about the piece, there are a lot of great themes. I don't know that he composed it like, okay, I'm going to put this incredible structure behind it or anything. I don't know. I guess it's a rhapsody. This is what I'm feeling right now. This is what I want to express right now. But I think the rhythm is really what makes it magical. And so when we fast forward 100 years, Charlie Parker has existed. Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington have matured as great, great artists of our time. Thelonious Monk has been here. John Coltrane has been here. Aretha Franklin's been here. So all of this great American music that functions around the rhythm section, and that's the other thing, like the rhythm section as we know it now did not exist in 1924, really.
Right.
So I think that what that allows a person who wants to give it a new look or bring it into the 21st century, it means that we have the benefit now of true jazz group improvisation. So like when I did it, I used, on the recording I did for Sony Classical, I used a big group. When I do it now, when we do it with Philadelphia or any orchestra, it's mainly now my trio. But what's important is that when we play jazz music, it's really important to understand that true compromise is the only way this music works. Like we have to resolve conflict. We have to resolve, the conflict of resistance and cooperation, right? Or, the concept of individual and collective, right? In other words, how do we figure out a way to make room for what everybody's hearing? Keep in mind, too, everybody's hearing different stuff. So the bass player is playing stuff, the drummer, Jason, he's playing stuff. I'm playing things. And somehow we still have to make sure that the people don't get confused and start thinking, what are they playing? Is this still Rhapsody? What's going on?
Right.
So the structure of the piece is very important to maintain. And it's also important to make sure that when it's time for the orchestra to play, I've got to have a very clear set of cues that let the conductor know, okay, this cadenza's done. We're 2 measures before rehearsal 6, so now you can bring the orchestra back in.
Yeah, that clear communication. And one thing that strikes me about what you just said is that it's a real synthesis, right?
Yeah.
And so in addition to smoothing out, these different perspectives, a successful performance of this piece is a real merging of sensibilities where you're not toggling back and forth between, okay, here's the orchestra and here's the trio, like a tennis match, right? It's really much more fully integrated.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's organic. In other words, I only agreed to do it because I felt like I could bring an authenticity where both styles could be truly manifest in our performance of it. And I felt very comfortable, with that, because the themes are great. Jazz musicians have always enjoyed improvising on Gershwin's themes because they're easy to improvise on. They're not boring, but they're a little repetitive. There's enough repetition where a musician or an audience person can know what you're playing and how it relates to the structure of the piece.
Mm-hmm.
With jazz music, none of this music is about you by yourself. It's really about you with other people. And if we look at American democracy, like if we look at the cultural framework of our country through the Constitution, right? That's ultimately what the struggle has been. Are we going to be a set of individuals, or are we going to have a shared collective belief system that will transform us from just being selfish individuals into being a group of collective people who care about each other and who want freedom and justice for all people, even people who don't look like you,
right.
even people who don't believe what you believe, that you're willing to make that room for that. And I think a piece like Rhapsody in Blue encapsulates all of that.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. And it brings me to a question I wanted to ask about Rhapsody in Blue as Black music, so to speak, because Gershwin obviously had his ear tilted in a particular direction. He was very genuinely interested in the music that, that was already being called jazz. But at the same time, there are some tensions there because, Paul Whiteman got a lot of credit. He was called the king of jazz at various times. And the press, one of the glowing reviews after the Aeolian Hall concert was in the New York World. The critics said that, this piece had made an honest woman out of jazz,
Oh my.
So, there are some, shall we say, problematic undertones there. But, I wanted to ask you about this piece as an expression of Black music, even though it was performed, premiered by a white orchestra, and Gershwin is a Jewish American, but there is a kind of energy in the piece, and all of the influences in the piece, seem like a real homage, trying to, as best he could, celebrate this music. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, like I say, the themes are African American at the root, because of the blues music that was going on at the time. These themes are, and of course the rhythms, right? In other words, when you hear it, you don't think it's German, right?
Right.
We don't think it's Italian. It has a clearly American feeling to it. I know Gershwin, he ran into James P. Johnson, right, when he was young. I don't know how much they talked or communicated, but they certainly knew of each other, because James P. Johnson, he wrote Yamacraw 3 years later in answer to Rhapsody in Blue, and he called it a Negro Rhapsody. So, there was clearly some interaction going on before the first integrated band that Benny Goodman had with Teddy Wilson and Gene Krupa. But my feeling is, when we think of Black music, whatever that is, I just tend to think of it as the expression of the experience of Black people in the United States after slavery, right? When we think of the fact that you couldn't play drums in any city during slavery except New Orleans, right? And that New Orleans would be the city where jazz started and was expanded upon. I think what that tells us is that a group of people who were finally free and had what everybody else wanted, or at least in theory, or at least in terms of the legislative process and the war that took place, the Civil War and all that, a generation or two later, they were still dealing with very rough circumstances, right?
Yeah.
Very difficult circumstances. And so when you deal with that, you have to create an identity, or at least a sense of what something that represents who you are would look like if you could have it. And that's what jazz is. It's a music that establishes, well, first of all, it comes from the people. Like, these people weren't kings or queens. They didn't come from a lot of money. They didn't come from a lineage of wealth. They had to describe their wealth based on the music they played, the virtuosity that they could exhibit, the colorful things that they could do that exhibited their identity. Charlie Parker, the fact that even they had nicknames like Bird and Count and Duke, and so it was really a search for identity and a search for a sense of regalness in terms of their identity. So I think that Rhapsody in Blue encapsulates that opportunity for us to establish, in the case of my version, a true delving of the piece into the actual jazz environment. It's 100% there. And that's why I tell every conductor, when we play this piece, it's different every time. It's a new version every time. We don't play it the same way every time. So that means that it's an authentic representation of jazz music, and it's an authentic representation of classical music, because the orchestra is still playing what's on the score. The conductor is still conducting his orchestra based on the rules of engagement there. So when you put all that together and it's authentic, then you have an experience, okay, which to me is the key with art. It's not so much about the art, really. Like, I can go by myself and play the piano by myself, and that's fine. But really what matters is when you have an audience and you play music for them. It's not about the art. It's about the interaction or the engagement of each person in the audience with the art and what that experience provides them.
Right.
That's what's magical. That's what I think makes any music of value. But in the case of jazz music, we're even influenced by what we hear from the audience. So if people clap or if they scream or whatever they do, it influences what we play. And so jazz music is really about individuals influencing each other and then adapting to those influences. Yeah. And again, this is a great piece where we're able to demonstrate that.
Gershwin had certain ideas in mind, and he was trying to evoke certain kinds of feelings and sounds, and you're able to come in and say, well, he was nodding in this direction. Well, let's follow that. Here's what I think he was trying to evoke. And I have a broader context that I can bring that puts it in, sort of, I can put my hands in that soil, and here's what this is, and here's how we develop it. It's right. It's a really rich way to experience this work.
Well, thank you. It is a rich way to experience it because, again, the piece is fantastic. People love it. If you play it the way it's been played, everybody has their interpretation of it. But I did want there to be a version of the piece that didn't stick 100% to the rules of engagement. So I'm going to freely improvise on it. I'm going to freely reinvent the thematic material and use other influences from my childhood, from Earl Garner, from Monk, from the church, from Ravel, from, whatever spontaneously, subconsciously comes to mind. Because when you improvise, think about it, like when you walk, you don't really think about walking. It's a subconscious activity.
Right.
When we practice, that's a conscious activity. Like we're specifically practicing whatever it is that we're trying to get together. But the real trick, the real difficulty with jazz improvisation is how do you go from the conscious practice of either transcribing a solo or working on patterns or whatever people do, how do you go from that to a spontaneous subconscious release where the music leads you wherever it leads you and everybody has that trust and empathy of each other on the stage? When that happens, I don't even call it communication, or at the lowest level, it's self-expression, okay? Like we express ourselves, right? When we communicate, then of course we're all paying attention and we're aware. But the top level is communion. And communion just means that we all feel the same thing in the audience, on the stage. When that happens, I call that a moment of communion, which I think is key to any significant change in a group of people.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that word, with all of its connotations, I mean, it is wildly inclusive.
Yes.
Everyone in that space is a part of that communion.
Yes. Yes.
And so that I wanted to bring this up. You earlier today, you had a rehearsal with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and it so happens that there is significant historic connection between this orchestra and this piece, because the 1945 recording that the orchestra made with Oscar Levant on piano was a huge hit. And it actually contributed to a kind of renaissance in interest in Gershwin. And so it's really beautiful that the Philadelphia Orchestra, has this landmark 1945, and now here they are all these years later with you on the piano and your trio.
Wow. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. It reminds me of a lot of, like, even if you think of any great event in American history that we reference as a milestone, or we reference as something that's significant, something that's important, whether it's Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, or what, anything that the culture decided this is important.
Mm-hmm.
And Rhapsody in Blue falls in that category. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about, you've played this piece with a number of orchestras. We have 3 concerts ahead of us. And I wonder if you have any particular premonitions about, how this one will feel, or how things will go.
Right. Well, that's the beauty of the subconscious and the conscious, because I may have an idea of how a cadenza is going to start, but I really have no clue how it's going to end or where it's going to go.
Yeah.
And I try very hard to literally allow the music to move through me, almost like a recording that's taking place spontaneously.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to hear, what should that recording sound like? And I'll give you an example. If we think of Beethoven, right, who's perhaps he wasn't the greatest writer of melody, perhaps he wasn't the greatest orchestrator like Ravel or Rimsky-Korsakov, perhaps, but when you hear any of his works, they're perfect. And they have, I think, what Leonard Bernstein called the sound of inevitability, meaning that, right? That's, you know what I mean? Like, when you hear that, that's all that could have been. Like, it couldn't have been anything else,
mm-hmm.
right? So every note that follows every other note, like, he may have struggled with it, and my understanding is that he did, he wasn't one of these people who just wrote and it just flowed right out, and there'd be 9 versions of these 8 bars.
Mm-hmm.
And finally he got what he wanted. And when he got what he wanted, when you would listen to it, it couldn't have been anything else. So for me, when I improvise, that's what I'm looking for. I'm hoping for some moments where what I play, it had to be that.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing is, I'm making it up.
Yeah.
And of course, and the other big thing that I want to get people to understand is that the rhythm section, right? That's the foundation of all American music, right? Everything.
Yeah.
I don't care what rock and roll, hip hop, it doesn't matter. The rhythm section, meaning a piano or keyboard, an electric or acoustic bass, and a guitar or a set of drums. Okay. That sound is the soundtrack of 20th century American life. And what's important about that is, so we're making up stuff underneath an orchestra that's playing written music, which means that we're literally responding subconsciously to them as a group,
mm-hmm.
not one individual. Now, everybody's doing it, And that's why it's different every time, because no two musicians are going to have the same exact idea all the time. Like, we're all responding in our own special way. And again, it represents what we want in our American dialogue, which is that somehow we have to get to the point where we're not just disagreeing, but we're actually listening to opposing views, different points of views, right? And we have that sense of wanting to protect everyone's dignity and sense of wanting cooperation from other people. Because in jazz music, without that, we simply cannot play.
Yeah.
Like, if we can't agree to have real, true respect, a cooperative approach, a project that is unity-based, unified-based, right? If we can't agree on that, it is not possible for us to improvise with any real substance.
Yeah. Well, we are in 2024. It is an election year.
It is.
And,
indeed it is.
You
Yes,
know,
it is.
if only the body politic would look to the example that you're describing and setting, I think everyone would be in a much, much better place.
I think so. I think culture, I think music is, my argument has always been that everybody should play music just like everybody should play sports when they're a child, regardless of talent level, regardless of ability level, because I really believe that it's another way to teach teamwork. It's another way to teach daily discipline, right? It's a way to teach math. I mean, there's so much in music that, first of all, it just sounds good. And I think, you know, you play for your family, or you play for your friends, or you play for everybody at school. It builds self-worth and self-esteem. I know it did for me.
Yeah.
So I would argue that to take music out of the schools, I never understood it.
Right, right. You have had the experience of composing music and you know, waiting for its premiere and having that you know, that momentous occasion where it first gets played in front of an audience. Right. If you sort of put yourself in Gershwin's shoes, you know, let's say February 11th, 1924, right. You know, he's been working hard on this piece. He had a very short amount of time to put it together. His orchestrator, Ferde Groffet, has, you know, fleshed it out with this, you know, this score. Skipping ahead a century, what do you think would surprise him most about the life that this piece has had and the way that we're talking about it today?
I think the fact that he would look on the stage and see a set of drums and see a bass player and a piano, the fact that there would be video cameras filming it, the fact that somebody would post something about it on social media right as it was starting, I think he'd be like, what is going on? But he'd be cool with it. You know, he'd be cool with it. I don't think he would have a problem with it. He was a progressive thinker. He was somebody who always was pushing for that next thing, you know. And I think he would be thrilled with what's happening with the piece. The fact that so many people love it, so many people play it, and that there's still an audience who wants to hear it and who are open to these new ways of exploring it.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you are on the piano.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
When you first recorded and released this work in the mid-90s, classical institutions were, you know, beginning to warm to the idea of bringing in musicians who improvise, you know, musicians coming from the jazz tradition. And I feel like we're in a much different place now.
Oh, yeah.
You know, can you speak to that evolution and how you feel about it?
Well, I think it's great. I think that, look, jazz and classical music need each other. There's no reason for these two worlds to not coexist. It's ridiculous that they're separate. You know, it's just as ridiculous as the separatism that happened in the United States between black and white people. It makes no sense. It doesn't mean that there aren't different cultural points of view between each music, but that's the thing. That's what makes bringing them together very special. And for me, the person who really championed me in my work and my vision with this was Seiji Ozawa. He really pushed me and said that we need more works that represent a collaborative approach between jazz and classical music.
Mm-hmm.
So after doing Rhapsody in Blue, then I did Concerto in F with him, and we did it in Japan, and we did it with the Berlin Philharmonic. I mean, he was always a very strong proponent of my work, and then he encouraged me to write, another piano concerto in 2016, which I did. So I think he understood that styles were changing. As much as people love Beethoven's music and, the music of Wagner and all that, they do. But you've got to play some things that really do represent right now. I think we have to think of even this piece, Rhapsody in Blue, and not so much think of 1924, but think of 2024. Think of what can a person do with this piece today if they hear it, right? And that's my goal, is to give people something. They can decide what they want to do with it, but make it clear that it's for you and it's about you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Marcus.